I've come from the Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion at the London School of Economics. What I'm hoping to cover in today's talk is to introduce you to the English National Pupil Database, to discuss findings from two recent projects that I've been doing using the NPD, the National Pupil Database. Briefly to touch upon a new project that I'm starting in the autumn using the data. And then very briefly I'm going to mention issues that have just arisen the week before I came over here with data access, because I'm really interested to hear how people deal with these issues in different institutions and countries. Okay, so the National Pupil Database. So this is a pupil-level database of all children aged 2 and upwards in state-funded education in England. So that's about 93% of all children. About 7% of children in England go to private schools. They're not included. But anybody in state education is in the NPD. And there's about 600,000 kids per year group cohort in the NPD. So currently there are records for about 20 million children because it stretches back to the early 2000s. And until recently, it could be accessed fairly easily on request to the Department for Education, who are the data owners. There was a stringent process of application and approval, but it was pretty okay to get it, and then you would store the data, a cut of the data at your institution to analyse it. I'm going to talk a bit more about changes there later in the talk. The pupil-level information in the NPD that's available to researchers includes, obviously, a child identifier, which you can use to link longitudinally and cross-sectionally. There's information on whether each child claimed free school meals, which is a proxy for low income. There's information on children's ethnicity, whether they have English as an additional language, their date of birth. There's information on their ascribed special educational needs and/or disabilities. There's information on children's exclusions, fixed-term exclusions, permanent exclusions, reasons for exclusions. There's information on children's absences from school, length, reason. There's information on whether children are in care. There's also the child's address, though often that's not available to researchers, and instead we'd be given a sort of lower level area identifier. We have information as well on things like the distance from the child's home to their school and the distance from the child's home to their nearest school. So stuff like that is quite interesting for looking at things like school choice and inequalities there. We've got information for each child on their recorded attainment at various ages. So at the moment, that's roughly at age 5, 6, 7, 11, 14, 16 and 18. And we've got information on the school that the child attends. And so at the school level, obviously we have the school identifier, which we used to link with the pupils. We've got information on the type of school it is and the governance of the school, so whether it's an academy, how autonomous it is from the local authority and the state. We've got information on the funding, which is related to that, and the finances of the school. There's a lot of information on school level test results at different ages and how that hits targets or doesn't for different groups. And then we've got the geographical and locality information for the school. And then a lot of data linkage is possible and has taken place with the NPD. So obviously because we've got the geographical information, we can link that to more information on the child's locality or the school's locality, things like deprivation or employment levels. We can link on to higher education levels and follow the children through post-compulsory education. We can link to school inspections data, so the grade that's given by the Ofsted Inspectorate to the school. We can link also to large-scale sample studies. So, for example, we have the Millennium Cohort Study in England, which I think is fairly similar to growing up in New Zealand, and that's linked to the that's linked to their NPD to sort of synergise that and kind of get the best out of both data sets. And also the NPD can be used to link to samples in trials, for example, ad hoc individual research projects. So if you're running a trial, you can then link to the data for the kids in the trial in the NPD. You can also create matched samples in the NPD for that research. And so the DFE itself, the Department for Education, publishes quite a lot of extensive national official statistics using the NPD, broken down by key characteristics. So whether children claim FSM, their language, their gender, ethnicity, whether they have special educational needs, the local area. So they publish yearly information on attainment at different ages, on school exclusions, on school absences, on recorded special educational needs and disabilities, and on patterns of children in care. And then in terms of the research studies that have taken place by external researchers requesting data from the MPD, here's a few examples of recent studies. So there was one recently which looked at whether schools with a higher proportion of free school meal pupils are assessed less favourably by Ofsted. So Hutchinson found that there was a bias there, that Ofsted, the inspectorate, tended to downgrade schools with a lot of poorer kids, controlling for things like progress, attainment and other variables that should kind of cancel that bias out. In terms of preschool research, Gambaro and colleagues have looked at whether children in poorer areas tend to attend preschool with less qualified staff. There's an ongoing kind of plethora of research looking at why children in London attain higher levels than those in other areas. So there's no conclusion on that yet. It's ongoing, really. Burgess is saying that it's mostly to do with ethnicity, that we have lots of motivated immigrants in London. But then Blandon and colleagues say, nope, it's much more complicated than that. It's lots of other factors that are accounting for this. So that's ongoing, and the MPD is a good source of data for looking at that. And then a recent piece of research that I did, linking the MPD to the Millennium Cohort Study, was looking at whether children's stream placement in their schools seems to drive teachers' assessments and perceptions of pupils in a way that's disproportionate to their actual attainment. And I found that streaming is associated with biased teacher assessments. So I'm going to now talk in a bit more depth about a recent study that I've just had published with my colleagues Ludovica and Kitty. It's available in the British Educational Research Journal. If anybody would like to read it in more depth, please give me a shout if you can't get through the paywall, and I'll send it to you. So in this study, we're looking at whether there are inequalities in access to free early education before compulsory schooling. And here's a bit of background. So, in England, children are all educated within school year cohorts, which correspond to the structure of the academic year, from September through to August. So the academic year runs September to August, and kids born within that period are in one school year cohort and are educated together. And all English children start primary school in the academic year in which they turn 5. Alongside this, all English children are entitled to 15 hours of free preschool from the term after they turn 3. So there's a slight misalignment here, and what it means is that autumn-born children are entitled to 5 free terms of preschool, spring-borns to 4 terms, and summer-borns to 3 terms. Now, in England, spending on young children has increasingly been dedicated to the free preschool allowance that parents are theoretically given to spend. Everything else has been cut under austerity. All the other kind of early intervention, targeted provision for kids has been cut, and the money is basically being pumped into this. And there's some evidence that high-quality preschool can be beneficial to children's development, particularly for low-income children. But obviously, children can only benefit from early preschool if they attend it. In this project, we look at whether among the autumn-borns who are entitled to the most free preschool, in theory, who actually accesses their place for the longest. So all parents are entitled to 15 free hours a week at least, but who actually accesses that, who actually accesses a physical place. And we look at how take-up varies by income level, because we're particularly interested in low-income children because they under-attain throughout education. We look at whether other factors relate to differences in take-up among low-income children. And we look at whether other factors account for that variation. The data that we use is slightly old, but actually this is beneficial in a way that I will explain as I go on. So we use data for the group of children who enter reception, the first year of primary school compulsory education, in 2011, and the autumn-borns of those children, so that's just over 200,000 kids. And we link back their preschool data to their data in the MPD the previous year, which establishes whether they were attending at the beginning of their entitlement, because if they were attending, they appear in the data. If they weren't attending, they don't appear in the data. And in the MPD, as I've said, we also have information on a proxy for low income, children's ethnicity, their language, and the locality of the child. Now, we have a slight problem with the preschool data in the MPD, because in preschool, most children don't get free school meals. So we don't have the income proxy. So what we do is we link forward to the children's records in the first 3 years of primary school, and we see whether they get free school meals once they're in primary school. And in this autumn-born cohort that we're looking at, about 77% of children never get free school meals in early primary school, so we assume them to be higher income. About 5.5% get free school meals once, 5.9% twice, and nearly 12% get free school meals all the way through early primary school, so they're the sort of presumed lowest income, persistently poor children. So if we just basically look at how non-take-up of the free preschool entitlement varies by income level, we can see that nearly 20% of all of the autumn-borns don't attend at the beginning of the free entitlement. But this rises to nearly 30% among the children who are the poorest, the thrice FSM children, and it drops by nearly half among those who never claim free school meals, the richer children. Fewer children don't attend, so more of them are taking up the free entitlement to preschool. And we also find sort of vast differences by ethnicity. So among Bangladeshi children, nearly half don't attend from the beginning of their entitlement, and this drops to about 13% among white British children. There's also sort of partially corresponding to this a big difference according to home language. So among children who only speak English, it's about 13% who attend from the beginning of their entitlement. Among children who have English as an additional language, this rises to nearly 40%. But as I say, we're particularly interested in the patterns among low-income children because they under-attain throughout education, whereas children with English as an additional language in England catch up very quickly, and sort of by secondary school they are outperforming the English-only speakers on a lot of measures. Similarly, a lot of ethnicities are outperforming the white British kids by the time they hit secondary school. So we look at whether variation according to these other factors accounts for the poor children attending less often. Is it that they are the non-English speakers or the Bangladeshi children? And it's not. So basically there's lots of interesting interactions, but the main message is that it's income level that seems to be the kind of primary driver here at the pupil level. So then we look more at the local level and we look at the local authorities. And so there's various ways of kind of dividing England up administratively, but this is dividing it by sort of over 300 local authority administrative areas. And there we find that there's a vast variation in take-up of free preschooling. So it ranges from the authority with the highest attendance, where only 4% of children don't take the free entitlement from the beginning, up to over 50% in another authority. And so then we're interested in what is it about the local area that's promoting attendance or not. And obviously we've got local area factors like deprivation levels, so the percentage of children in the area in very low income households. But we've also got vast variation in the type of preschool provision that's available. So in England, it's built up through a very haphazard sort of history of different markets, different funding. And so we have some areas where practically all of the preschool provision is in maintained sector settings, which tend to be school nurseries attached to schools. But then we have other areas where there's no provision of that type, pretty much. Similarly, we have areas where the private sector dominates, so practically all the provision is in private sector settings, which tend to cater more to working parents, and they also charge extras for things like lunch, for registration fees and so on. Sure Start is another type of provision that we're particularly interested in because Sure Start was set up particularly to target low-income families, and it provided a more comprehensive service through children's centres, which had more outreach, which had more kind of provision from the baby stage for families, and which also includes preschooling. So you've got areas with no Sure Start in 2011 up to areas with 25% Sure Start. And so we do find that the local provision is quite heavily associated with whether children attend preschool. So in areas where there's a lot of private sector provision, the gap between the poor children and the richer children is large, for pretty obvious reasons, because private sector settings tend to cater more to richer families who are working, they charge extras, it's not really free. Even though parents are supposed to have this free entitlement, in practice can they actually spend it in the area? It doesn't really seem so. You've got high non-attendance there among the poorer children, and you've got high attendance among the richer children. We're also particularly interested in Sure Start because of the fact that it's been cut. Sure Start centres are closing down. They're still closing down. So since 2011, I think we've lost about a third of our Sure Start centres. So that's why it's quite nice that we have the 2011 data with enough of them remaining, that we can look at this and we can see that actually Sure Start, a predominance of Sure Start in the area promotes equality in attendance. All children are more likely to attend in areas with more Sure Start, and the gap between richer and poorer children is smaller. So yeah, sort of in terms of the gap between the richer children and the poorer children, we find that it's not accounted for by pupil level factors really, but it is accounted for to some extent by these local area provision factors. And this sort of has implications for the way that the free entitlement to preschool is enacted in England, because simply providing an entitlement in theory is not actually allowing people necessarily to access in practice. I'm going to move on now very quickly to talk about another piece of work using the same data, but the whole cohort this time, so sort of 600,000 plus children, so the autumn borns, the spring borns and the summer borns, the whole school year cohort. And we've got a working paper on this out in the autumn if anyone's interested. In this project, we are looking at the longitudinal data for this cohort of children, and we're interested in their transitions from preschool to primary school. And the reason that we're interested in this is that transition to primary school is a really important step in children's lives, both in the short term, because obviously, experientially starting school is a big deal for children and for families. And it's a big deal from a well-being point of view and so on. And we're also interested because in the long term, there's evidence that a good transition, a good start to primary school can have a relationship with later attainment and later well-being. And particularly this is important in England because formal education begins for most children at just 4, so that's when they start primary school, so they're very young. And so there's evidence that continuity and familiarity are very important factors in a good transition. And we're able to use the data to look at which groups of children have more or less continuity of peer group and of institution during their journey from preschool to primary school. There's several sort of different journeys that children can make from preschool to primary school. So as I mentioned earlier, quite a lot of, about 50% of the provision, the preschool provision in England, is in school nurseries attached to schools. And so about 35% of children in this cohort stay in the same school between nursery, preschool and school reception. So they have a lot of continuity in transition. They're already in the building, they're already, the teachers have a bit of knowledge about them, the handover is easier and they have the familiarity with the environment. But then you also have some children who switch from a school nursery to a different school, either one that had a nursery the previous year or one that didn't have a nursery the previous year. And when you start digging into this, you see evidence of inequalities. So, for example, it's low-income children who are more likely to move from a school nursery to a school, a different school, which is a less favourable transition, arguably, because, your parents have chosen for you to go to school nursery. Ideally, you would stay in that school for reception and have that continuity, but actually we see that disproportionately it's the poorer children who are pushed out and shifted into different schools. You've also got, obviously, the transition from a private or voluntary sector setting to a school, and then you've also got about 6% of children who don't attend preschool at all. They don't appear in the data, they don't get any funded preschool, and they just appear when we hit school. And we find that in this group, it's more likely to be low-income children, it's more likely to be children with English as an additional language. Now, obviously, in the data, what we can't tell is whether these children maybe have come from overseas and they might have attended preschool elsewhere, or they might have not attended but lived in England but not had the knowledge to access or the language to access, and there's some evidence that that is the case. Black Caribbean children are another group who tend to have less favourable transitions here, and also children with special educational needs and disabilities. And these are two groups who, throughout schooling, tend proportionately to be disadvantaged. So it's interesting that even at the transition, they are also disadvantaged. And we also can see the proportion of children who start primary school who were in the child's preschool setting. And that tells us about the continuity of peers that a child has between preschool and school. So about 22% of children start primary school with no peers who are familiar from their preschool. Everyone in the class doesn't know each other. And then, on the other hand, you have quite a bunch of children, 15% of this cohort, start with nearly all of the children in their primary school being familiar from their preschool setting. Again, here we find that children with English as an additional language are more likely to make the transition with no peers at all. Again, Black Caribbean children are more likely to have no peers when they start, no familiar peers when they start school. And we also find that summerborns are more likely to have no peers when they start school. So that leads into my brief introduction to my new project, which I just wanted to touch upon here because it would be interesting to see if anybody here has any linked interests. So I'm going to be starting this project in the autumn, kindly being funded by the British Academy. And this new project is going to be using the MPD data to look at month of birth and special educational needs diagnoses in primary school. And I'm going to look at inequalities there according to children's characteristics, interactions between children's different characteristics and local area factors and school factors and so on, and at children's trajectories of diagnosis of special educational needs throughout primary school. As I've explained, just for a little bit of background, children in England are educated in these year group cohorts that are quite rigid, running from September birthdays to August birthdays. So in England, summerborns are the relatively youngest. When they start school, they're 1/5 of a life younger than their autumn-born peers. And there's a vast array of evidence which shows sort of indisputably that summerborns are disadvantaged throughout education. They score lower on all the tests. This does diminish somewhat when you sort of go through secondary school, but it's still pretty big by the end of secondary school. They score lower on sort of measures of self-esteem. They're more likely to be bullied. Basically, any measure you have summerborns are disadvantaged. And they're more likely to be attributed special educational needs and disabilities. So obviously, there's a question here, and what it indicates is that there's disproportionate allocation and attribution of special educational needs there, because there's no reason why, having been born in the summer, you're more likely to have ADHD, to be on the autistic spectrum, and so on. And even actually, if you look at things like whether a child is recorded in the NPD as being deaf or having a visual impairment, you see a gradient there by month of birth, and there's no reason why this should be the case proportionally. So I'm going to use sort of 10 years plus of MPD data to look longitudinally across cohorts and along children's trajectories, because there's quite a lot of change in attribution as well throughout primary school. And I'm going to look at how birth month, in combination with other key characteristics like income level, ethnicity, home language, gender, how does this all affect children's propensities to be attributed special educational needs or disabilities, or different types? Because different types is interesting, because being attributed dyslexia, for example, can be positively associated with attainment. However, being attributed things like emotional and behavioural difficulties in school can sort of have a negative impact on children's trajectories. So type, as well as kind of high-level attribution, is really important. I'm going to look at how this changes over time and between cohorts, because we've had a lot of legislative change in terms of SEND provision in England over the past few years. We've had a massive 10% drop in the total number of children attributed any level of SEND. I mean, that ties in with austerity and with budget cuts generally. It's harder to get attributed, but how does this interplay with children's different characteristics? Who's kind of won and who's lost out in these kind of macro level changes? And I'm going to look at how all of this relates to children's attainment. Very quickly, I just want to say that I'm hoping to do all of that, but the week before I came here, we have this big emergent issue going on with data access. I'm really interested to hear how this is dealt with in different settings and countries. So previously, DFE sent us cuts of the MPD. We would request the data we need. We would securely store it in our institution on the secure server, and we'd analyse it there. This was not ideal. Obviously, there's a lot of data being sent out. It's not the most efficient or secure way of doing things. However, the DfE have basically panicked in light of the recent General Data Protection Regulation, and currently what they've decided to do is to move to secure lab access only. Now this is unworkable because the secure labs don't have the capacity. There's currently 300 live NPD usages. It's going to change for them as they go on as well, they're saying, and it's going to change for new requests. So this is an unworkable solution. It's just going to curtail a lot of projects. And obviously, as somebody who's just got 5 years funding to do this project, I'm slightly worried about what this is actually going to mean for me and for all the other people who have kind of pending projects using NPD data. So I'm really interested to hear about alternatives that balance risk and utility to kind of feed back to colleagues in the UK and to colleagues at the DfE. So thank you so much to Nicola and to her colleagues and the University of Auckland for inviting me here. Thank you to the Nuffield Foundation and the British Academy for funding, and to my co-authors. Thank you so much for listening.